Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the event tonight. We'd like to start with acknowledging all the amazing sponsors that we have. We have CSL, NOS or NOWS, Zendesk, Matt Ritchie from the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, and recently we got the R Consortium also funding us, which is great. We would especially like to thank Zendesk for tonight's event. They provided us with this amazing menu and drink, and we really appreciate that, and the recording as well. So there is this announcement. We have internship offered by NOWS Group. So this is exclusively assigned for the R Ladies members. So NOWS is actually a very famous, like award-winning management consulting firm. So they're offering this for the R Ladies member, which is great. So they have some services. You can check what kind of services they do. They do a lot of consultation for different businesses and management. If you are a student, like tertiary student, and you are actually interested to get involved with that, they would offer part-time or full-time internship. So please come and speak to one of us. Like today, you can talk to me or Goknur at the back if you're interested to apply for such an internship. So we are really grateful to NOWS for offering us such a great opportunity. Our next event also is just a few days later. So we have on the 26th of September, another amazing speaker like our speaker today. So we have another one, Alison Hill, who is talking about how to get a sad plot, make it probably happier and better. So please come and join next week if you're interested too. So it brings me to our amazing speaker today. So I'd like to introduce Saras Windecker. She has bachelor in biology. She has also master's degree in environmental studies. She has a PhD in quantitative and applied ecology at the University of Melbourne. And after that, she started as a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Bioscience for ecological modeling. And she's interested in a lot of open source things and the complicated forecasting and modeling, those sorts of things that we all are interested in as well. So this is my great pleasure to invite you to come and speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much first to R Ladies Melbourne and Anna, who couldn't be here, for inviting me. It was almost a year ago that we talked about doing this presentation, and we had lots of wonderful chats about what I might talk about after lots of conversations with Anna, so I really appreciate that. I want to thank her even though she couldn't be here today. And I'm really excited to talk about this subject today. I've given this presentation now a few times, which hopefully means that it just keeps getting better. The topic is generally reproducibility and specifically containerization, which is not a word I knew a year ago, and I don't expect others to necessarily know. Ooh, mood lighting, thanks. So I'll get into that in a second, but I thought I'd first start with why reproducibility, why this topic in general. I work on a lot of different topics, plants, wetlands, strange fungus, bacteria, infections. The career has taken me to a lot of interesting subjects, but sort of through all these different topics, what I've actually been really interested in across all of them is this idea of how do we do our science the best we can do? And I think that applies to those who aren't doing traditional research exactly, but are doing perhaps data science and other kinds of modeling. It's always relevant because in the end, we have to be able to be trustworthy in the work that we produce. Take nobody's word for it is a scientific motto, and I think that we have sort of started to forget about this as we seek to sort of publish our work, and in this craze of publication, we can often forget that in the end, we need to have trustworthy results, And that then goes both ways. We need to both have that in our own work and have other people be able to evaluate our work by that metric as well. So recently, and I would say recently, but I think that we've been talking about this already for quite some time, the reproducibility crisis, as they say, has been more and more discussed in the literature in a range of different fields: psychology, oncology, which is what people think I do when I say ecology. I have to let them know I'm not saving the world with cancer science. In any case, we're starting to have this discussion across a range of fields, and it's coming up in a lot of different venues: Nature, Conversation, and all of these conversations are focused on this same question of, if we seek to reproduce results, we can't necessarily reproduce them. And this causes some problems in terms of our credibility. The decisions that are made in a lot of real-world problems are based on the research we produce. So why is this happening? And I'll point a really great paper by my colleagues here called Meta-Research for Evaluating Reproducibility in Ecology and Evolution, but there are similar papers in other subdisciplines as well. And there's a lot of different reasons. One is publication bias. We're so pushed to publish, and publishers want to see sparkly results, things that are shocking and going to change the world. And what that means is that we maybe aren't seeing those results that are more realistic or aren't telling us the flashy story we want to hear. Questionable research practices associated with this bias and this culture, everything from p-hacking or rerunning models to get the results you want, perhaps hypothesizing after you've seen your results. All of these things contribute to a wider issue of the reproducibility of your hypothesis or your result, and as well, inadequate data reporting. So we might have produced some flashy result, and then if we want to recreate that or test that again, it can be very difficult if the data is not presented or prepared in a way that we can use it. And insufficient incentives. So we're starting to see journals suggesting that we need to have open code and open data. So that is getting better. But, has anyone ever tried to use someone else's data or code? This is a really good start. So insufficient incentives is the first step, but I'd argue I should probably add to this list, and we can update this paper to say badly shared code and data. So it's really not enough, even if we have increased incentives. And all of this sort of still speaks to this wider problem of reproducibility of a result. And that is a bigger question, but reproducibility of a result is actually, can be, all right, I'm getting ahead of myself. Appropriate segue here. So we have these problems, we have insufficient reporting, we have bad reporting, we have essentially useless reporting. So what can we do to make this better? And the answer is there's a range of open science tools. This is one paper I really like that discusses this, but there are a range out there now talking about how we can address this wider problem using a range of tools. And I'm going to talk about some of them today. And so to bring me back to my previous point, we have this bigger problem of reproducibility of our literature, and that's this crisis and how reliable are our results. But from a very narrow standpoint, if we think about code and data, regardless of whether we can reproduce our big finding about the role of X and Y or these bigger questions, from a much narrower perspective, at a real basic level, I'd suggest we need to be able to rerun our exact code or our exact analysis and get the same result. That seems like a baseline. That seems like it shouldn't even be a factor. If we're talking about reproducibility, it should be a question of the grand hypotheses and how can we have reproducibility in the literature because of these inherent biases. But actually, the very basic level of take what you did and actually do it again, we can't do it. It's so common, and it's common. This is not a chastisement of some, vague other. This is of myself. If you rerun or open your own code from the past, it doesn't always work. And it's really frustrating. So this concept has been called computational reproducibility. The idea that at a basic level, if you reproduce the same code and rerun it, you should get the same result. Whether or not the result is good, whether or not your code is good or you made good assumptions, you should at least be able to reproduce that result. So I'm going to talk about two ideas, and this might seem like cheating because I said in my title, containerization, and we're going to get to that. But before I talk about containerization, I want to talk about this idea of a research compendium, which is not a word I created. It's been discussed in a lot of different literature over the last 20 years or so to encapsulate this idea that all the components of your project should be in some sort of reasonable structure. So organizational system to distribute, manage, and update the collection, everything involved in your research project. In my opinion, there's 4 key aspects to a compendium, but a lot of different people have written about this topic. The first is organization. So separating your data from the code used to modify that data. At a base level, we have all been there. You have your raw data file and you think, I gotta fix this thing and then this thing, and you do it and you oversave it, and then what do you have? Crisis. Ooh, probably crisis. It's happened to me, it's happened to a lot of us. If you overwrite your data, you can end up having a real problem if you don't have those raw results and the things that you did to manipulate them. Second would be documentation. So specifying what is needed to reproduce that analysis. Automation, some sort of order. This has also happened. I ended up ditching a chapter of my thesis to the side of can't do this right now because I opened it up again and there was just 1 million files. And they all had these strange abstract names like 1_modified data, 2_ a little bit more. You know, this is so common and we're afraid to talk about it because it's a little shameful, but we all do this, especially as we're learning. And a master script can help with that. It sort of says, this is the order to do these various things in. And dissemination, a way to share it so that we can have open code and open data and open things. So I've already given a few examples, but one example of a chapter that did make it into my thesis, I was looking at plant decomposition. As we can obviously see here, the plant is decomposing. It's brilliant. Okay, what happened? I wrote a great model. It took a really long time. I didn't know anything about Bayesian analysis or using STAN, and I learned, and I wrote heaps of code, and it took me way too long. This is also a common story. And what happened? Yay! It worked! Oh my gosh. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but essentially I was predicting decomposition, and it was all working, and I was very excited. So what happens? You send it to your supervisors, you push it away and work on everything else because you're now extremely behind. And you update R, of course. And then, you have to, just a little tweak. Your supervisor says that maybe you should, add in this parameter or change it like this. And you think, no problem. I wrote all this code. I'm a genius. And it's just chaos, just dumpster fire of chaos, right? And this happens for so many reasons. So I had thought that I had really worked hard. That first chapter that was just complete chaos, I had learned from that, right? This new code was beautiful. It had an automation script, it had an order, but why wouldn't it reproduce? I give you a little hint before. I updated R. I'm curious, has anybody else here had this problem? Yeah, any other reasons that you found that well-written, well-organized code didn't reproduce? Update of a package? Don't want to share. It's too embarrassing. It's fine. I understand the feeling. Okay, so there's a few different things. Software versions, as we've heard, R package versions, R versions, operating systems, a whole suite of other options. This is probably an unnecessary part of the presentation because we all have this in the back of our mind, is this like trauma that we don't want to access and think about again. But this happens. Okay, So I'll put this up again. In my particular case, what happened was the documentation specifying my dependencies, I'd written it down. I knew that I used this package and this package. What I didn't know was that as those packages, as the R version updated, the R packages weren't going to perform the same way. And it took a long time to figure out that I just needed to download the tar file of the package and use that. Any case, I figured it out without completely rewriting all my models, which is a relief. But it was very scary. Okay, and I will admit, my computer then stayed on that version of R for the next 3 years until I submitted. Because even though I'd solved the problem, it was too scary to change anything. Okay, so this is where containerization comes in. Actually, you know what I wanted to do? I'm going to do some live coding here, and I think at this point I'm going to stop and do a bit of a setup of our project to start with, and then I'll get to containerization. So to sum up of where we've gotten so far, we've all had problems of irreproducibility. One of the problems can be software versions, and the starting point of a solution can be a research compendium. So I'm going to start there. Can you still hear me? No. Testing? Okay. This is a little high, but I think it's going to work out. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a fake project according to some of these principles that I've outlined here. And what am I going to do? I'm going to go to GitHub. Is this easy to see? This is not GitHub. All right. I'm going to go to my GitHub, and I'm going to start a new project. And you can ignore this. All right. Repository. Exciting. New. Okay, so I'm going to call this my gold star project because it's going to be amazing. Okay. So I'm going to copy this link to my project, and I'm going to open our studio. Okay. Too much? Yeah. Okay. All right. And hopefully get the order of this right. So I'm going to show a few different steps here. So if any of this is not exactly familiar, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but hopefully slow enough that we can all be together on this journey. And then we can talk more about some of these other steps later if we're interested. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new project. This is not a necessary step of this process. I'm not trying to dictate how this is done, I'm just giving one example. Okay. So I am going to create a project from a given directory, but I haven't started my directory yet. So maybe I won't do that. Maybe I'm going to start my directory first. Okay. Actually, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. No, I'm just going to start in a directory. New project. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Shush. It's busy. All right. New project. Try this again. Why does it keep telling me this? Yes. Okay. Yes, this is what I want. Okay, so I'm going to paste my repository URL here into my new project. I'm going to call it Gold Star Project. And actually, I'm just going to put this on the desktop to make it easy for me to find. Create project. So what it's done is it's created and cloned the repository that I created on GitHub, and it's put it here on my desktop. If I move this, I should be able to see it sitting here. Gold Star Project, sitting right here. Great. Okay, so I've got a little R project here. There's not really anything in it. It's a bit boring. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy in this data that's conveniently sitting right here, and I'm going to copy it into my... Yeah. I'm going to copy it into my project. All right, there it is. My data is sitting right here. So I'm going to do a few things now. I'm going to create a raw data folder, and I'm going to move that inside. Because this is data that I don't want to touch. I want to make sure it's sequestered away. That's good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a paper, and it's going to be brilliant. I'm brilliant. Great. This is content that's telling you how R Markdown works. I'm not going to go into R Markdown detail now. If you're unfamiliar with this, it's essentially a document that can include code. So I think you can follow this if you're unfamiliar, but if you're interested, it's a very useful tool. So before I keep going, I should just orient you in case yours looks a little different than mine. Down here, I have my console, and that's where you can type in the code. And the top here, I've got my file. I've got my environment, including my Git pane, and also my file structure here. So let's see. What I want to do is I want to read in my data. I'm going to call it decay. I'm going to say read my data. It's in my data folder, and it's called decay data. Okay, but this needs to be inside a code chunk. So I'm going to make a little chunk, and I'm going to put this code inside of it. So if I run this, we could look at it here just to get a little sense of what we've got. I've got species code, T for time, and mass remaining for how much mass there is at the time. Great, everything I want. So I'm going to make a really simple paper here, and it's going to have one plot. All right, I'm going to call ggplot, and I'm going to use ggplot decay data, where my x is my time and my y is my mass remaining. And I think I need to now tell it that I want a point plot. Let's see if that works. Okay, gotta load my package first, and then make my plot. And there it is. Super brilliant, very interesting, wonderful decomposition data. Okay, good. So this is now ready to be published. So I'm going to save it. Okay, great. So we can see now here in my file structure, I have my paper, I have my data, and in a real project, your compendium might include some other things like code. And you might have that here in a different structure, but for now, this is sufficient. For what I want to show, this is good. And you know why? Because it's all self-contained, my data is clearly established in a separate place, and I have a paper that's all good to go. So in the meantime now, I'm going to save all this. I'm going to commit this to my repository on GitHub. I'm going to say, add my data. That's good. All of this is up here. I'm going to say, what is this? I don't want to commit that. I want to commit my paper, my brilliant paper, draft 1. Great. So then if I make any changes to this, I could commit something new. And I'm going to not commit these for now, because it's not that important. Okay, so I'm going to push those up, which should mean when it's done that if we go to my repository and click refresh, what happened? Here it is. Great. So I've got my data and my paper, and if I wanted to, I could also push up the R project file. I could add a README, could give some descriptions, but for now, this is sufficient. We've created a research compendium for this project, and it's all looking really good. So for now, I'd say that given some of my requirements here, we've ticked some of these boxes. We've done some good organization. We don't have a lot of documentation yet, but we do have automation because our paper sort of runs that code for us in the right order, and it's now ready to be disseminated because it's shared on GitHub. So to take us back now to where we were before, we were talking about this project is a good start, but what's going to happen if I update R and something happens to ggplot? This project's pretty simple. It only has one package, so I think it'll be pretty stable. But we don't know. We don't know. So we're going to have to do a little extra step to get this a little bit extra gold star status. So I'm going to explain containerization with an analogy that I came up with. And I apologize, but I also don't apologize. And here's why. I'm not a computer scientist. Containerization never made sense to me because when you go and you learn about these services, you get taught by people who just speak like genuinely different language than you. You sit there and they just start talking about all these things and they're using it for purposes you don't understand, and it's really too much. So I'm going to explain this in the way that understands to me. So if that doesn't work for you, you can go on from here and look at more detail elsewhere. But I think that one valuable benefit of this kind of learning environment is that we can speak each other's language. So I hope this works for everyone. The idea behind containerization is that you encapsulate the environment and all of the tools that you use to run your project in what's essentially a virtual environment. It's like building a house. So there's three main terms related to containerization that I think are relevant for us to understand. And that's given that one of the most popular implementations of containerization is a software called Docker. This isn't the only way to do it, and I don't really understand what Docker is, but I know it's a way to do this. So that's going to be good enough for now. There's three terms related to Docker that we come across that don't make a lot of intuitive sense. A Docker file, a Docker image, and a Docker container. So I'm going to try and make these a little clear here with my house. So the Docker file is the instructions for your tiny house. It says, take this container thing on wheels and give me a portico and give me 3 windows and a kitchen with plumbing. And that's really great. The instructions, that's just a document. That's not your house. You could save that document and give it to someone else, so they could give it to a builder to make the same house. You could share it onto your repository. It could sit on your local computer. It's just a file. The second term is your Docker image. Your Docker image is your built house. There it is. It's looking great. It actually has taken the instructions in the file and produced that into a physical house. Okay, that's the tiny house version. It's not really physical, but it is an environment that has been created. So the Docker image in terms of your project, maybe your Dockerfile said, give me R 3.5, give me ggplot, and give me, yeah, that's sufficient for our project. So we told it those things, and the tiny house that was built from that had all of those things installed, and it's sitting there built, but it's on wheels, right? So a Docker image is not a file saved on your machine. It's an actual built environment. And what you can do with that environment is either have it built on your machine, so it's sitting there waiting for you to step inside of it, or you can send it to the cloud so that other people could wheel it away and use it themselves. So I just said another word here. A repository for these images is called Docker Hub. So we can see one here that I've made for one of my chapters. It's called Biomass Carbon. It's the same name as what the repository is called on my GitHub. So this is not a file. This is an actual built image. So if someone were to download this image, they could use the virtual environment that I already specified. What we can do is we can look, tags. We can actually look at what was specified inside of it, but I can't find it. Description. I'm going to go to a different one and show you. Oh no. Okay. I'm going to search for okay. So here on Docker Hub, we're back in Docker Hub, and this is a Docker image that was created by an organization called Rocker to prepare useful, predefined tools together for you into an image that you can build upon. So you can think about this built image as a tiny house that's really basic. And then what you want to do is you write on top of this file and you add more components to it. So let's see here. In this Dockerfile, in this set of instructions, we have a bunch of things that are very confusing if you don't write in shell. But thankfully, we don't have to understand them all at this point. We can just say, okay, it's got a from, so it's got a base house that you're building off of. And then it has a variety of commands for adding things to this house, to this environment. So we're not going to go into this detail, but this is just to show you what this might look like. So this Docker file is sitting here, but here on Docker Hub, it's not just a file, it's the actual image. It's the actual built house. So, all right. So we've got our house, we have our file, it is our instructions, we've built our image, we have our house, and it can either sit on your computer, so you can go inside of it on your computer, or it can sit in the cloud. So that's our 3 images, but I think I went out of order here, so we're going to skip that. So just as I showed you, there's that from label in the Docker file. What you're actually doing with a Docker file is building off the instructions that were used to create a previous environment. So maybe you had this image, the one on the simple one, and you're saying, okay, take that house and now give me outside flowers, give me a greenhouse, and give me, I don't know, it's so fancy. How is that still a tiny house? Okay, but essentially what you're saying is start with this image, give me all these other things. Right? So your Docker file might say, pull that image, start with that house, give me all these additions, and then build that house. Right? So our Docker file is our set of instructions, and our set of instructions can dictate where you start from. What's your starting house look like? And our Docker image is that built image. It's the actual house, but we haven't gone inside of it yet. We're not in the house, we can't play with our new window, we can't water our flowers. It's just sitting there and it's ready to build and it's on wheels, right? So we could also share it, but we're not using it yet. A Docker container, which is now our 3rd term after Docker file and Docker image, our Docker container says, we've built this house, it looks great, I'm gonna wheel it away to Banff, and I'm going to set myself up in front of the mountain, and I'm going to walk inside my house, and I'm going to do all the things that I put inside my house. So I gave myself an oven, I'm going to bake some cookies, and everything is there that I need that I specified. So similarly, a Docker container on your machine is something that you can go inside of, and you told it to have R, and you told it to have ggplot. Those things are there for you, and they're ready to use, and they're exact versions that you specified. So now you can recreate your analysis using the exact versions of everything that you have pre-built. So I hope that was helpful to somebody else. Essentially, to go back to here, these are those 3 concepts, and there's a lot more concepts related to Docker as well, but in my perspective, in this use that we might have, which is having a project and wanting to containerize the environment we used, these are the most important topics. And we might, there might be additions and add-ons, but for the moment, I think if we understand those ideas, we can make use of this technology. Okay, so as I said, it's a type of virtualization. It's not as heavy as a virtual machine. So an actual virtual machine might be Windows 95, and I don't actually know what a virtual machine is, but it's like a lot more stuff. Maybe it's like a whole real house, right? But a container is a tiny house. It only has what you gave it. It doesn't have all that other stuff. So that has its benefits and its downsides. But one benefit is that it has everything you need, and it doesn't have extra stuff that might break. And it's popularly implemented with Docker. Okay, so I did already show you guys this one. I showed you Docker Hub, where you can have the built images, and it also has the Docker files. So that's a good place to sort of play around, to start looking at a bunch of files that have already been written. And it's also somewhere that you can pull built images from to build on top of. Okay, but we're not going to be building Docker files from scratch today because it's hard. And I don't think it's a necessary starting point. I think that if you start to really decide that this is going to be useful for you in your workflow, that's where you're going to have to get to. You're going to have to get to the point where you're comfortable enough with the components of that Docker file to work really with that tool. But there's an easier way to get started. So if Docker files from scratch are highly flexible but extremely confusing, then there's a variety of R packages that sit on the other side of the spectrum. They're less flexible, but they're much easier to start with. So none of the things that I'm going to show now, I would say, are the be-all and end-all. They might be, but you might also build off of them and see errors. And I can't anticipate what all those errors might be. So by no means am I suggesting that what I'm going to show now is going to work for everybody's project completely seamlessly. And the reason for that is this. These things try to make it more easy, but they don't allow you to make all the adjustments you may need to make. So I'm actually going to show Hole Punch today, which was written by Karthik Ram. And the reason for that is that it sits on the far side of the ease spectrum, and so it does two things. Well, both of these packages allow you to automatically populate a Dockerfile with what was in your repository. Let me step back. What that means is you might have a project that's very simple, like my brilliant paper, and it's pretty clear what was included in that. I needed R and RStudio maybe, and I wanted ggplot. But in a real project, you might have lots of packages. You might have lots of code, and you actually don't know what all those packages might be. So to make this a little easier to implement, what a lot of these packages do is they automatically troll through your code to find out what those requirements are. So Hole Punch does that. And additionally, I said that when you build that image, you take your file and you build your Docker image. In order to do that step, you actually have to have Docker installed on your machine, which is a lot more overhead. Downloading Docker, setting up Docker, building that machine locally, it requires you to have a bit of command of using the terminal, which is not necessarily common knowledge. And I think that by making that a requirement before you start doing this, it just means that fewer people are going to try. So one of the things that's useful about the Hole Punch package, much as RStudio allows you to start to do interact with Git without using the terminal, is it allows you to start working with Docker without having to use a lot of command line interface. And so when we actually use Docker to build our image, it actually creates our image for us. Hole Punch manages to not have Docker installed on your machine because it leverages other infrastructure on the web that does it for us. And I'm going to get to that when I do our demo. Okay, so this is what I just said. It automatically prepares our Dockerfile using metadata contained in a description file, and I'll show you how that works. And it launches or builds your image and launches the container without having to download Docker by leveraging a tool called Binder. So now we're going to do that. It's going to be exciting. Deep breath, everyone. Whew. Halfway through. Halfway through. This is the exciting part. We're containerizing. Yay! All right. So what have we done so far? We have a project. It doesn't have any metadata though. So we're missing some of our key factors of having a really good compendium. Is this big enough? Okay. So I'm going to use a Hole Punch function. And this way of calling a package just allows me to call a package function without loading the entire package. I like to do this sometimes because then I don't have to load so many things. So this is the one we want, write compendium description. So I'm just going to press enter here. Ooh, done. Okay, so it says, I wrote the .description file, which we can see here. And it says, please update the description fields, particularly title, description, and author. All right, so I'm going to open this file. What has it done? It's given me some metadata for what's going on here. It gives you the option to add a title, to dictate who the authors are, and perhaps give an email so that if people want to get in contact, they have a way to do so. Give a description. You could add a license for your package, which is often a concern of making your code and data open source. And we can see here, crucially, that it has pre-populated for us the packages that were needed to produce our file. We can see it was actually much smarter than I was because it knew that because I have an R Markdown file here, I also need knitr and R Markdown to be included in my container. So that's really useful. And the other thing that it would do, which we're not going to demo, is that if I had a package downloaded from GitHub, it would know, magically almost, that it came from GitHub, and it would add it here with another field. We're not going to show that now, though. So that's very exciting, and that's a brief description of this kind of file, and you can find more about that online. So one of the reasons I really like the hole punch package, and even now going forward, if I write my own Docker files from scratch, I'm going to continue to use this approach. Because what it means is that instead of having to list your R packages manually in your Docker file, what the Docker file made by Hole Punch does is it just says, read the description file. So if you update your description file, you won't need to re-update your Docker file because it'll just access which packages you need based on what's in your description. I'm gonna let that sink in. It's pretty special. It's pretty amazing. All right, so we've got now so far is we have a metadata file, which is really useful, separate to containerization, just to document your compendium. And what I might do at another point would be to add in my details here. I'm not going to do that now, but maybe I'll just change this and call it my gold star project. Great. Yeah, I'll just do that for now. Okay, so that's what we've done. We've set up our description file. It's automatically populated what packages we need. And now we're going to create our Docker file, which is going to leverage this description file. And to do that, we're going to use a function called hole punch. Let's see, which one is it here? It's a variety of options, but we're going to use this one, write Docker file. What did it tell me? Setting active project. Warning, the version of R matching the last modified file is 3.6. However, you're running 3.5. Okay, that's true. I think that my project should still work with 3.6, so I won't modify it. But one of the things that this is noting for us is that we can actually specify which R version and which R date we want to specify from. So if the project that, if you want to do this for retrospectively for a previous project, you can do so by specifying the previous date and the R version you want to use. Okay, so what's this done? I think I need to refresh here. Great. So in the new version of RStudio, you can see hidden folders. So that's just a note about why this is visible. It's produced a Docker file sitting in this folder called .binder. So I'm going to open that, and I'm going to open my Docker file. And it's quite simple. It says, using this base Docker file, so this is the basic tiny house that I want you to build off. I'm going to add a label for a maintainer, so I could add my name here. Oops. I could add another label with my email address and other details, but I'm going to leave it for now. I'm going to set my user to be this project here. I'm going to go to GitHub and look at the description file and download from CRAN those packages and their dependencies. So that's what this line is doing. So what's the problem here? It's a little tricky. So far, this description file isn't on GitHub. So if I were to try and build this image now, it actually wouldn't know. So one of the downsides of Hole Punch, in my opinion, is that you have to have everything pushed already to GitHub in order to launch and build your image with Binder. But that's a small price to pay, I think. So I'm going to save that, but we can see basically this is how it's leveraging your description file, and that's pretty special, in my opinion. All right, so I think we're ready to get this going. I'm going to commit both of these files, add description, and not that, and Dockerfile. So one thing I'll note too is that because the Docker file is saved in a folder called .binder, you could have two Docker files. So this Docker file says from binder. And so this is starting with some of the underlying materials needed to be used in the web interface that's going to build our image. But if you didn't want to use that base and you wanted to have this Dockerfile and another one, you could have a base Dockerfile in your repository as well. So that's something that they thought about that I think is also very well done. All right. Did I push this already? I'll try again. Okay, great. So I've created my description file and I've created my Docker file, but I haven't built my image yet. It's just the instructions. So now I'm going to go to my web here. I'm going to go to my project. I'm going to update it, and I can see here that we have my .binder. We've got my Docker file sitting right here, but it's not clear to me yet, how do I launch this image? So now we need to use our third function. So if we're keeping track, it's pretty amazing. We've only done two things. We've done write compendium description and write Dockerfile. So we haven't had that many steps. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do generate badge. So essentially what this function is doing, and it's not a necessary step of the process, but I'll show you why it's helpful, is it gives you automatically this nice little URL. And what it's telling you to do is it says you can copy this into your README so that on your repository, it's very easy to click it and go straight into launching your container. This is not a necessary step, but let me show you how that will look. So this, I got rid of it. This is a friend's project here, Matthew Ling, and he's got a binder button on his repository. So this is what it's saying. This is saying somebody could go to his project, go to his repository, and they could actually just click this button and they'll be sent directly into a virtual world that has everything needed to reproduce this project. And I've done that because it takes a few minutes to load, so I've done that here. So what we can see here is that we're in an instance of RStudio, and all the files for his project are sitting right here, and all of the packages needed to run his project are also existing in this little world. So what we've got is that binder, which I'll show you now, mybinder.org. Binder is a tool that basically takes your Docker file and builds the image on the web. And this is really powerful, and I'll tell you why. Eventually, you might want to get to the point where you're building and working inside Docker files for your own use. You might want to say, my R has been updated, but this project that I'm still 3 years behind on needs this old version of R. So you might have Docker you might have a container on your machine to work on a particular project that uses an old versions of something. But that's a separate use case. I confused myself here. Let me try that again. We might have two uses for containers. One might be actively working on a project. So in that case, you'd say, this project is old, it needs old infrastructure, I want to be able to update my machine, so I'm going to create a container so that I can work inside of this old space as I'm going. The second use for the container might be this. I want other people to be able to reproduce my work easily. Because let's be honest, even if you share your code and you share your data and you share a Docker file, if other people are unfamiliar with how Docker works or how to use the terminal, they just aren't going to take those steps to reproduce your work. So what's the point? If it's not easy for them to do so, they probably won't. So in an effort to make this reproducibility as easy as possible for our peers, this is one tactic. If we have a repository that you can access a container with the click of a button, it's going to mean that reproducing each other's work is much easier, which in the end is the goal. So for that goal, Binder is very effective because it means that somebody else reproducing your work doesn't need to have Docker installed, doesn't need to really understand containers at all. I would say that if your goal is to do the first requirement for containers, working inside one on your machine, this is going to be a more clunky way to do it. But for that second goal, this is a very useful tactic. And that is what the button does. So if we go back to our project and we copy this code, I don't have a README file. I'm going to be lazy and do it here. I don't think I need that. Okay, so what do we have? This is saying the button is going to be called Launch Our Studio Binder. This is the little logo that's going to appear, and this is the URL. So actually, if I copy this right now and put this here, the same thing is going to happen. This is going to launch my binder. The other thing that I can do is I can save this file and scroll down, and we see the button right here. So by clicking on this, that's going to do the same thing as typing that URL here. So what we can see is it's building my binder based on the things that I've specified in my Dockerfile. It's giving me ggplot, it's giving me knitter, it's giving me R Markdown, and all of these things are things that must be necessary to run the packages that have been specified. So while this runs, it's going to take a few seconds. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to reorient us to these two main benefits. So what we showed with our first two functions, write compendium description and write Dockerfile. So we saw that it automatically prepared a Dockerfile, and it automatically specified which packages were needed. And I think that this step, so for my personal workflow, I'm adding in this step even if I don't use hole punch to create my Dockerfile, because I automatically produce description file with my dependencies is very valuable. The second thing that it does is it builds your image via binder. This is not going to be very useful if you want to work on it locally, but it will be very useful sort of at the end of your project to have a neat and tidy end place to show off your work to other people and for yourself in the future. It's worth mentioning here, though, that we don't know what's going to happen to binder, right? It's just an open source tool. So in terms of the real long-term sustainability of the rerunability of the projects, I think it would be probably useful to think about how to understand Docker files for your own use in case something happens to Binder as a platform. It's not going anywhere for now, but it's worth mentioning. Okay, so while those images are being built on Binder, I'll go over here then a few other things that I'm sure we all already agree on. Reproducible code has a lot of benefits. Fewer mistakes and less duplication, more interpretable and more easily shared, and more reliable and robust science, which is ultimately the goal. So there are a lot of ways to tackle these various problems with reproducibility. I think what I've shown today is just one way, but Docker and containerization is very powerful. And I think that we are often at a disadvantage I can't speak for everyone here, but coming from a non-computer science background in understanding how to make use of some of these tools. So what's happening now in the R world is that more and more people are trying to make these tools translatable to be more easily used. And so my goal today was just to show one way that we can access these tools, and there will be more and more as we progress in the future, and it will be worth developing some skills in this as just another part of your toolkit, because I think it'll become increasingly important as we use more and more of the packages that are being developed. So let's go here now, and what it's done is it's produced this virtual RStudio environment, and all of my files are sitting here for us, and we can try and knit this paper. Let's see if it produces. It's exciting. Ooh, all right. It worked, and it's brilliant, obviously. So what we've produced here is a very simple version of what you might do if you have a project and you have a published paper. I think you could do this even if you don't write your papers in R Markdown. You could do this and just have your figures reproduced. So someone could go in here, and if you have a very clear order of when your files are run to produce which results, they could do so here and reproduce those files. whether that's your final paper or just the figures and results, that is very powerful. And it's just a click of a button away. So I think that's the end of what I had, except to say, as my examples demonstrated, and all of us have experience in this, the first person that will rerun your analysis is you. So we might have high and mighty, lofty reasons for doing reproducible science, but I think one of the earliest reasons that made me make this change is because of my own frustration. And so if that's your only justification, then let that be your motivation. And I guess that's it. Thanks to R Ladies Melbourne and Karthik for producing Hole Punch.
I feel like I should know these things like when I was doing my PhD. I was still dealing with my PhD stuff and I can't produce them on my new system. Yeah, so that was the great talk. Do you have any questions?
Yeah. Great.
Examples were great, like to me, so understandable. Yeah. So can I start with this question?
Yeah.
So if I already have like projects and everything, can I just go there and do this, like use that a Docker thing and then make a Docker for what it is there?
Yes. So well, there's some things that I don't exactly know how it would work for. So what's that thing that bioinformatics people use? There's some other thing that's not. Bioconductor. Sorry, I don't actually even know what bioconductor is, but I know that I don't think the defaults of hole punch will work directly for something like bioconductor things. So the defaults that I'm showing here, it may not be that it works directly for your project.
So you say it would work with bioconductor or would it?
I don't know that it would, but I haven't tried it. Yeah, I think I mentioned, I gave this in Sydney and someone said that it didn't work for her things that were using bioconductor. I don't exactly understand what those things are. But the point is just to say, this will work as a base level, but I think if you have additional complications in your project, you might have to get to the point where you can manually edit the Dockerfile as well. So
Docker itself would have some issues with like bioconductor, and it's not just the package.
yeah. Basically just to say, I don't exactly know how it would work with something like that, but because this creates an actual file here, I can add things here. So if I needed pandoc or something, you could add it in here, but that's the kind of thing that you would then have to get comfortable with how to write some of this content. And so it is to say that, yes, it should work if you open up. And I mean, I can do a demo here. I'm imagining people want beer, but I can open up an old project and show what it would look like, that it'll populate that description file. But there are a variety of things that might be inherent in your project that it may not automatically find. So it's just a, what's the word, disclaimer. So it didn't work default for one of my thesis chapters because it needed some different latex stuff, for example. And so, yeah, I mean, there's going to be a few cases that you might encounter where this default is not going to work for you. But what I'm hoping is that what this does is it gives you the baseline to work from. Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah. I'm sorry, Paul, can you speak up? Yeah, that's a really good question. So the question was, do you need a separate container for each R script? So no. So if you had your whole thesis, for example, in one R project, or not in an R project, in a repository, then you could run the right description, and it would troll through and find the packages included in all of the files of that project. And then you could make one container for your whole thesis, for example. You wouldn't need to make one for each separate project. Equally, if most of your projects use the same 6 packages or something, you could write one Dockerfile and build one image that then can be used to recreate many different projects. So right now, the binder, the way the Dockerfile writes, and it calls here, it calls your github.com to read your description file. This then means that this repository has to be public. But you could, I'm trying to determine how useful it is to show it versus just describe it. There are other ways to write this. So you could, for example, write here a bit of code that means that it reads the local description file and builds then the container based on the local file. So then you wouldn't need to have pushed it. You wouldn't need to have made the entire project public. So the GitHub repository needs to be public for this Dockerfile, the way it's written, to work. But let me rephrase. So there's 2 things there. If you really want the whole repository to be private and not shareable, then what you would need to do is change this section here. But if you just, if you're happy to have the repository and the code, everything public, and you just want the data to be private, you could have, you could not put your data on the repository. And here, if someone's inside this, am I on the web? No. If you're inside here, I think that you can upload a file. So if somebody had the data on their local machine, you could build the repository and have the button for a public repo that doesn't contain the data. But then to rerun the project, someone who has the data would then need to add it in here, like this. That's another way.
So it does work for private repo. So the point is we need to set that like header setting. So then it would work for the private one.
So the automatic one is not going to work for a private repo because it's set up to call from this web page that's not going to be accessible if it's private. But so then there's 2 questions. Do you just want your data private or the whole repo?
If we want whole repo to be private,
if you want the whole,
we want other people as kind of like users of the GitHub page.
Yeah.
So they kind of could access.
Yeah.
But it's not public.
Yeah. So if your GitHub repo is private, you're just going to need to use different code here because this is building off. And I can show you one version of that. How do I open? Oh my gosh, file structure is so embarrassing. Don't look.
I think this is possible. It's correct.
So, okay, here. This is amazing. All right. We're here, so I'm just going to keep using my podium. All right, so the hole punch package leverages the description file by using the version of the description file that's on the web, right? We saw that here. It says, go to GitHub and read my description file. There's also a way that I recently discovered. I didn't write this. I found it on the internet, but I discovered it recently, that you can essentially do the same concept. You can say, read my description file to determine what's necessary for this project, but read my local file. So this is essentially, if you just copied this in to here, what it would be doing is Actually, I don't think that would work. That wouldn't work. Okay, the reason that wouldn't work is because, so this would work if you were building your Docker image on your local machine. If you have Docker installed and you build this image locally, it's not super difficult. If you have your image, if you have your Dockerfile, shush, what is happening? I don't know what that is. Okay, you would just do docker build, and then the dot is just saying, look for the Dockerfile in this repository. Okay. So that's all it would take to write in the terminal to build this file with this local description file. But I don't think it would work to use that local description file here because Binder is on the web, and so it's building your image, and it wouldn't have, I don't think it would know what's in the description file because it wouldn't have access to it. So I think if you want to have a, if you want to use the whole bunch default and you want to leverage Binder to build your image, it needs to be this version, as far as I understand. But if you're happy to make your, one alternative is that you could have a repository that essentially, right, okay, here, if I decided that I didn't want my paper and I didn't want my code to be public, I could just not commit it. I could just write my description file and push my description file to GitHub. So then I'd have a public repository, and the only thing in it is the description file and the .binder folder with the Dockerfile. In which case you could still leverage Binder and none of the project documents would be inside of it. But then none of the project documents would be here inside your container. They would have to then also upload. So there's a few different trade-offs then. I don't know that Binder can read from a private repo. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but I don't think that would work. Yeah?
I think this is outside the realm of hole punch and Binder, but I believe that in Docker, as used by computer science people, what they typically do is they only have the software environment inside the Docker image in the container, and any data that's accessed typically external to that, because in computer science uses of it, you might have hundreds or thousands of copies of that container active simultaneously. Of a large data set, you don't want to replicate it everywhere. And so they have this notion of being able to attach an external data set. So you might have some directory in your Docker image where the data is going to be. And when you fire up the container, you tell it map that directory inside the container to this directory outside on the machine that's actually running it. So you have only one copy of it, which will access. Of course, that means you've got to run it on some machine.
Maybe not this one actually. So what Ross then just said is that essentially what you can do is you can create a Docker image that just has your environment, and you can, if you've built that image, you can, when you run the image, so when you're like stepping into your container, stepping into your house, you can say, take this container, but then copy or map the files that I'm seeing in this folder into what I'm seeing in my container. So this is a project by a colleague of mine, James Kamek, and this is also an example of the fact that it's a really wonderful setup, but it's very hard for those of us to replicate. But he's got a really good setup here where you can pull this image, you can build it, and then you can rerun it inside of there. But, oh, it doesn't have what I thought it would have. Essentially, the line to map the files is using a docker run command, and this sort of falls in the sphere of slightly additional level of complication that you can work toward if you want to have this additional flexibility, and we can talk about that another time. But